Hello and welcome. I'm Alicia Bannon, Director of the Judiciary Program at the Brennan Center for Justice and Editor-in-Chief of State Court Report, a website dedicated to state courts and state constitutional development. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to strengthen and defend our systems of democracy and justice so they work for all Americans. While we cannot support or oppose any candidate for office, we can, and today we will, vigorously debate the policies and positions that matter for our democracy. We have a lot to talk about. Just yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled on its shadow docket that the Trump administration could move forward with steps to dismantle the Federal Department of Education. The president has also ordered cuts to federal education funding, including freezing more than $6 billion in grants last month. And the president is demanding changes to school services and curricula, including the elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Recently, the president of UVA resigned under pressure from the administration related to the university's DEI efforts. There are a lot of serious legal questions about what the administration has been doing, but federal law is only part of the landscape. States are also required by their constitutions to provide for a public education, and state laws can impose standards for curricula and services. State civil rights laws also offer students protections. State officials right now are facing difficult questions about how to respond to the current education environment, and state judges may be called on to decide whether state law provides a bulwark against at least some federal policies. Today, we're going to be considering how have the administration's policies affected schools so far, what might their long-term effects be, and what might be done to stop or at least mitigate some of the damage. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. Civility is important to all of us. Those who post rude or intemperate language in our message streams here on YouTube will be removed from the conversation. Live closed captioning will be provided, and you can follow along with the conversation on social media with the hashtag Brennan Center Live. Now, on to today's program. Here to discuss the Trump administration's action on education, their impact so far, and how schools and state constitutions might respond, we have an all-star panel. So we have Aaron Sager, who is a professor of law at Fordham University. We have Martha Dalton, a journalist with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And we have Dr. John B. King Jr., the 15th Chancellor of the State University of New York, the largest comprehensive system of public higher education in the country. Prior to his appointment to SUNY, Chancellor King served as the 10th United States Secretary of Education under President Obama. Thank you so much to all of you for agreeing to share your valuable insights today. And to our audience, please ask your questions in the chat, and we're going to be saving time at the end to hear from you. Thank you all for joining us as well. So now to get to some questions. The relationship between the federal government and state and local governments when it comes to education is complex and potentially confusing. So Chancellor King, you are the former Secretary of Education. Can you kick us off, particularly in light of the Supreme Court's ruling yesterday? I think Department of Education is very much on the minds of a lot of the people watching with us today. Can you just initially lay out for us, how does the Department of Education affect public education in the states or other education in the states? What are the impacts that we're going to see if the Department of Education is eliminated or dramatically curtailed?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Alicia, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. So let me first say, public education, I believe, is foundational to the health of our economy, our democracy. When I was a kid growing up, both my parents passed away when I was little, my mom when I was 8, my dad when I was 12. The only reason I'm sitting here today is because of the role of public schools, PS 276 and Canarsie in particular. So the stakes are very high here. The department essentially has 4 main functions. One is getting resources to vulnerable students. The Title I program that gets funding to schools serving low-income students, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act funding, which goes to support services for students with disabilities, Title III, that provides funding for English learners. So if the department is not there to distribute those dollars, the next question is, will those dollars still come? And what will be the stakes for schools, particularly the schools serving the highest need students? That's one area. Second area is our federal financial aid system. The Pell Grant program, which provides assistance to low-income students to pursue higher education, the student loan program, which makes higher education possible for low and middle-income students all across the country. Again, if the department isn't there, who will administer the FAFSA? Who will administer the federal student loan program? And the stakes, again, are very high. For us at SUNY, half of our entering students are Pell eligible students. If Pell were to go away or to be significantly diminished, or the financial aid system were to break, we could see thousands upon thousands of students missing out on the opportunity for higher education. Third, the Office for Civil Rights, which has an important role ensuring that students are protected against discrimination on the basis of race or sex or disability. A very large share of the complaints that go to OCR are complaints from families with kids with disabilities who aren't getting the services they're entitled to. Again, without the federal department there, and we've already seen major layoffs of folks at OCR, who will protect those students' rights? And that will be a difficult question for states to grapple with. How can they intervene to protect students' rights? The fourth area is around data and research. Think about the NAEP assessment, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that helps us understand where we're succeeding, where we're struggling. The federal investments in education research that help us learn what's working, how we can get better. All of that has already been hit hard by layoffs, and certainly yesterday's decision will accelerate that. So I'm very worried about the future of the federal role. And ultimately, education is in state constitutions. States are going to have to step up to protect student rights and potentially close very significant funding gaps.
Thank you so much for that. Aaron, I'm going to pull you into the conversation next to kind of pick up on a point that Chancellor King just raised, which is the role of state constitutions and other state laws. So obviously federal law plays an important part in our education landscape, but so does state law. Can you talk to us a bit more about what state constitutions in particular have to say about the right to education, both from a funding perspective, as the Chancellor noted, as well as from the perspective of establishing public schools? And you're on mute.
Thank you very much. I want to echo my delight at being here. As both you and Chancellor King have mentioned, the core obligation to provide public education in this country rests with state governments and not with the federal government. Every state constitution has some kind of language in it that imposes a duty on state government to make sure that there are public schools that are available to all of their residents who are children. So that's the core fact, is that the federal role in education has become very important, but it's not the federal government is not the central player. It's the states that are the central player, and the core legal obligation rests with the states under those constitutions. Chancellor King said, so if federal money disappears, the states are going to have to step up. And that sentence, I think, could be heard in two ways. In some states, there very well could be a legal obligation for states to make up lost federal funding, and that's because many, but not all, state Supreme Courts have read their own constitutions to say, when our Constitution says provide public schools, that means provide public schools of a certain level of quality, right? You have to do particular things. And so if the loss of federal funds in the medium term were to result in states not having access to enough funds to meet that quality level, then the state courts might require that states make up lost funds. Likewise, with respect to students with disabilities, states will still be under a federal statutory duty to provide an appropriate education for students with disabilities, even if the share of those costs borne by the federal government goes down. The other way to hear what Chancellor King says states should step up is that all states have a constitutional duty to provide public education, even if their state courts won't enforce it. So if you're a sitting legislature or a sitting governor in a state where the state Supreme Court is unwilling to interfere in your decisions about education funding, you still have a duty under your Constitution to make sure that you're providing public education to all of the children in your jurisdiction, even if the courts weren't forced to do it. And that is incumbent on you as a state officer who has made a promise to uphold the requirements of the Constitution under which they serve. Whether those officials will do that or not is going to vary from state to state, and whether they'll do it in a way that I personally like or the members of the audience might personally like will also vary from state to state. But every state has this obligation.
Well, and one dimension to that as well is we've seen some states themselves bring lawsuits related to some of the efforts to, for example, cut funding. So we've seen a number of state attorneys general and in a few instances governors as well actually go to federal court challenging some of these administration's policies. Maybe another dimension in which those obligations play out.
That's absolutely right. I will say that some of those lawsuits feel like short-term lawsuits, which is to say most of them rest on the idea that the federal government has made a promise to the states to provide particular kinds of funds, and they can't renege unilaterally on that promise. But that doesn't mean they have to promise to do it again in the next fiscal cycle. And so although those lawsuits are very important, if the policies of the Trump administration persist over time, that kind of fight is not going to help solve the basic shortfall of funds from the points of view of the states.
Thank you for that. I'm going to shift us to talk about another dimension of the Trump administration's education policies, which relate to policies, programming, curricula related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, for example, in April, going to what we were just talking about, 19 states sued the Trump administration over its threat to withhold federal funding from states and districts with certain diversity programs in their public schools. Other jurisdictions have embraced the administration's call to end DEI programming. Idaho, for example, recently passed a law banning teachers from putting up signs with political messages, which the state attorney general has concluded includes a poster saying everyone is welcome here. So we're seeing a lot of different approaches that states are taking in the context of DEI under this new kind of federal level guidance coming from the administration. Martha, I wanted to pull you into the conversation. In your reporting, you've looked at some of the on-the-ground effects of the administration's policies. Can you tell us what you've been seeing when it comes to how these DEI policies are playing out on the ground?
Sure. And thank you, Alicia. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this. Let me start with the K through 12 level, because I think that's where it's caused a lot of confusion. People have different interpretations of what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean. So for one of our local districts, which is a pretty left-leaning district in general, they weren't really sure what it meant when President Trump signed the executive order saying that they could potentially lose millions of dollars if they had DEI policies in place. So they voted to repeal some of their equity policies to the protest of parents, but some parents.
More by putting this underneath.
But what it ended up doing is causing a lot of confusion between board members, administrators. They weren't really sure if they would lose the money, but they thought they might. So they voted to repeal the policies. They got a lot of pushback from parents. And then when the courts intervened, 3 different courts intervened, basically saying that the way the administration had gone about implementing the order might have been problematic. And when the courts intervened, then they reversed course and reinstated the policies. So it's caused a lot of confusion in terms of what different districts are supposed to do, what DEI really means. But then also there are different levels that are being affected as well. So not just K through 12, but there was also a grant program it's a national grant program, but it is present in Georgia, called the Generate Grant, where people who are working on their master's degrees for teaching are placed in rural areas once they complete the degree. Well, that program was considered to be promoting DEI because it placed people in underserved areas, so rural areas. So it was eliminated. And, the AJC reported on a 7th grade teacher who was in the middle of getting his master's through that program. Not only can he not finish the degree that he might have to pay the tuition back because that was all part of the grant, right? It depended on people finishing their degrees. So that's another way in which people have been affected. And then thirdly, I just wanted to point out on the higher ed level, we reported on a researcher at Emory who was in the third year of a 4-year grant. She was doing Alzheimer's research, but she was particularly focused on the LGBTQ community. And the reason why her research focused on that community is because they're at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. And usually when you study high-risk groups, it's a much more efficient way to research, right? You learn about everyone when you study groups that are at a higher risk. But her grant was canceled in year 3 of 4 years. So not only is the research gone, but there's already been $2 million that have been spent already. So when things like that happen, I'm not sure if people are aware, but it's not just that the current program is being canceled or shelved or something like that, but there's already been an investment that now goes kind of to nothing, and there's no research at the end of it. So there are several different effects on several different levels.
That's fascinating to hear the levels in terms of the different kinds of schools affected, as well as just kind of the complexity in which, like in the number of ways in which these DEI principles are impacting so many different areas of work and research. Chancellor King, I wanted to invite you to join this discussion about DEI. I know this is something that you have been very involved in. Can you talk to us a bit about what you see as the importance and the stakes around this issue?
Sure. Look, diversity, equity, inclusion, from my perspective, are core American values. We are a diverse country. The notion of equity, the idea of equal protection under the law, is in our Constitution. Inclusion has been one of the great achievements of American education. When you think about the emphasis we've placed on making sure students with disabilities, for example, have full access to educational opportunity. So I'm very worried about the administration's attack on diversity, equity, inclusion, what it might mean for Black students, for Latino students, for Asian American students, for Native American students, for students with disabilities, in the higher ed context, for first generation students, for veteran students. For us at the State University of New York, the idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, is in our DNA. Our enabling statute from more than 75 years ago makes clear our responsibility to serve New Yorkers from every part of the state, makes clear our responsibility to provide the broadest possible access. So we're committed to those values. We have a governor and attorney general who are committed to those values. So we continue our work to make sure that our curriculum exposes students to the truth about our history, to diverse perspectives. We continue our work to make sure that we create a campus climate of belonging for students of all backgrounds. Now, where I think the administration has really been leaning in on the law, and particularly the Supreme Court decisions, is around the Students for Fair Admissions case. And they have really broadly interpreted that case to mean that any discussion of race is, by definition, a violation of the law. They talk about illegal DEI. I don't think the law supports that. There are several cases challenging their executive order, for example, on DEI. And I think we will see that their efforts are really going to end up being reined into just this question of implementing the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. In the meantime, though, we are seeing a divergence between blue states and red states, unfortunately, where you have red states in many cases adopting very aggressive policies around DEI and using the federal government as cover to say, well, we're going to stop teaching the truth about our history. We're not going to talk about things like slavery and the civil rights movement. We're going to ban certain authors from the classroom. And I think, unfortunately, you're going to see a real division where some states are unwilling to talk about those topics and other states will continue to move forward.
Thank you. Aaron, can I invite you to jump in as well? You're on mute.
I did agree with most of that, but I do want to mention one place where I think the chancellor and I don't agree, which is about it's being unfortunate that red states and blue states diverge. The Republicans I came up with when I was a younger person were people who believed that these questions of what schools should teach are inherently political issues. And I believe that too. And I'm very comfortable with the idea that state governments should be able to decide how they want to handle some of these pedagogical questions in the classroom without a federal veto. One thing this administration has in common with some of its predecessors is a tendency to be rather heavy-handed about these topics and to try to force states with other preferences from the federal preference to get into line. And my own view is that we would be much better off if the federal approach were to admit that these are political questions, polities are entitled to decide them, but that they're not federal questions, and that the federal government should be roughly agnostic about how these topics are taught and leave to the states the duty to provide public education in line with the way that their citizens want them to.
Chancellor, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I would just say I would agree with Aaron that the question of state standards, for example, should be determined at the state level and not dictated by the federal government. Why I think it's unfortunate is that I think as a country, we have to grapple with the truth of the institution of slavery and the reality that our history has in part been shaped by the fact that we had a whole group of people who were held in bondage and then denied equal rights. And when states try to cover over that history, I think that is dangerous to our democracy long term. So I'd agree on the question of who gets to decide about state standards, but I still, from a values perspective, believe that all states should embrace teaching the truth about our history.
We do agree about that.
Thank you so much. Martha, did you want to jump in on that question, or I can move to the next one?
No, I think they did a great job.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, although we can definitely turn back to this theme and also invite, again, the audience to put questions in the chat, because we're going to try to hear as much as we can from folks that are watching as well. Another recent change in the law was, at the same time that we're seeing federal funding cuts, we've also in the recent budget bill saw the creation of a national school voucher program. And so I guess, Aaron, and then maybe Martha, I would love to hear from you about kind of how those changes are impacting the states, their own legal commitments. How do you think states can and may respond?
So this is a very interesting program. It's brand new. We don't know a great deal about how it's going to look on the ground. Just for the benefit of brief summary, the new Big Better Bill, which I guess is now a Big Better Law, Big Beautiful and Better Law, establishes a tax credit for people who donate to organizations that can then pass that money as scholarships to children who are, I would say, not rich, is a fair way of saying it. The states have to agree to participate. So there is language in the new program that only makes this tax credit operative in jurisdictions where the state government has gotten on board. So the first thing that we should expect to see is disputes at the state level about whether they will join in or not. The tax credit is remarkable because it is a full 100% tax refund. If I give my $1,700 as a donation for student scholarships, the $1,700 comes off my federal taxes. So anyone with tax liability greater than the amount they donate gets it all back. And that's a remarkable way to run a tax credit. It's not how we deal with any other kind of charitable contribution. But some states, I think it's clear, will not be interested in participating, and many will. And there's been some speculation in the press about the states on the margin. To my mind, the most interesting feature of this program is that a lot of opposition to government vouchers for private schools have rested on some form of a claim that vouchers divert money from public education. And the idea has basically been states have to balance their budgets. So if they use state funds to provide for private education, those funds have to come from somewhere. And if their thinking is that there's an education budget of a certain size, it's going to come from the public schools. And so the vouchers damage the funding available to public schools. This program is not like that. The money is going to come from the federal treasury by way of the tax code. And the federal government, of course, does not have to balance its budget and does not. And so the voucher money that appears is an important fiscal problem for the health of the federal balance sheet, but it is not a threat to the state funding flows to the public school system. So one thing I think we will see is a reorientation of the debate about vouchers, especially as we have these state-by-state debates, that's going to have to de-emphasize this particular claim that the voucher system is somehow a threat to public schools. It's still important to public schools, right? One thing that it will do is perhaps, as it moves children towards private education, reduce the way that public schools are a glue in our society and bind communities together. But the fiscal effects are not going to be there. And I think even if one views this as an accountant, every child who goes to private school, if the public school budget doesn't change, that's actually a benefit for public school finance. So there are good reasons to be in favor or opposed to what the federal government has done. And there are good reasons on both sides, I think, in the states to oppose a particular state's participation. But it will be a somewhat different kind of debate than we've heard before about vouchers as the states take up this question.
That's fascinating. Martha, how are you seeing those debates starting to play out at the state level?
Well, Georgia actually has a program that's very similar to this. It's a tax credit, a dollar for dollar tax credit scholarship program. And Aaron outlined the debate exactly the way it's been in Georgia. People who oppose that program will say, public money should be spent on public schools, public things. It shouldn't be diverted to private schools. But the people who support the program say, just how Aaron outlined it, it's not as though the money is coming out of the public school coffers. It's, it's done as a tax credit. So it is public money, but it's not being taken from schools would be their argument. So I think, Georgia's already had that debate and continues to have that debate. So I think as states decide whether or not to opt into this program, we'll see that debate reemerge. A lot of it does come down to how public money should be spent and whether it should go toward private school education, or I think there are other educational expenses in the bill that you can spend it on. I think it can be used for tutoring and things like that. So it doesn't just have to be private school tuition, but I think you're likely to see that debate come back up again. How should public money be used?
Thank you for that. And Chancellor King, you're welcome if you want to join in, or I can move to the next question. If you had anything to add.
The one thing I would point out, taking Aaron's point about how the debate will evolve, I hope people will start to look at the outcomes. And the truth is, the outcomes of voucher programs to date have been pretty poor. And my argument would be there are better ways to spend these resources, regardless of the source, given what we know about voucher outcomes. But we'll see. Hopefully, folks will take a look at that.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to another question, which I'll pose to all of you or anyone that would like to take it on. One dimension of President Trump's education policy or approach to education has been a pretty explicit aim of influencing what students are learning. And I'd love, we touched on this a bit in the DEI discussion, but I'd love to go a little bit deeper about to what extent is that the role of the federal government, and what impact are we seeing with respect to academic freedom as we've seen this very, very sort of explicit set of goals in terms of impacting what's on students' curricula, and more generally, kind of what elements of that do you see as most concerning, or there's some that you see are maybe appropriate roles for the federal government? Someone like to take it first? Chancellor King, I'll cold call.
Sure. Well, look, I'd say historically, there's been a very strong push on the Republican side to rein in how much the federal government influences what happens inside of K-12 schools, on the theory that districts and states should be the primary decision making. So this is a departure. I think it's very dangerous. I think we're seeing sort of the weaponization of the education department to attack education that addresses the hard parts of our history. We also are seeing the weaponization of federal civil rights law, things like Title VI being used at the higher ed level to justify almost a federal takeover of higher ed institutions, to dictate what can be taught, to try to dictate who can do the teaching, a federal role in weighing in on the faculty, which is a huge departure from the tradition in American higher education. So I'm worried about that. I think you're seeing pushback, obviously, in the courts. You're seeing places like Harvard who have been very aggressive in trying to defend principles of academic freedom. My hope is that the entire higher education sector will say, look, we have a responsibility to make sure there is zero tolerance for discrimination or harassment, but we need to maintain academic freedom. We need to create environments where there can be rigorous debate about a broad variety of topics.
Thank you for that. Martha, would you like to jump in?
Sure. This may go in a little bit of a different direction, but I think one thing that concerns me from a reporting perspective is how states may decide to do things differently. And this, for an example, the state of Florida has decided to change its textbooks to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America now, whereas Georgia still has upper elementary and middle school standards that call it the Gulf of Mexico. And I realize that may seem like a little thing that's occurring at the moment. But I think if we continue to kind of move in that direction, we're really teaching kids in the same country different facts. So I think that's one thing that reporters need to be aware of, is how states are approaching their responsibilities. It seems like a definite pendulum swing, and the chancellor may be able to speak to this, because I remember when the Common Core several years ago, this set of curriculum standards that states could opt into became kind of this political lightning rod. And as soon as states started opting in, it became very politicized, and they started opting out. So we're not going in that direction anymore of everybody, choosing the same set of standards. But I do think we need to just, as reporters, be aware of what direction states are going in, and report what's happening in that respect.
Thank you so much for that. Aaron, do you have anything you'd like to add?
So the chancellor is 100% right about the higher education situation, which is really a threat to liberty in a very fundamental way. These the private higher educational, the private universities and colleges, those are associations of civilians, right? They're not part of the government. And the idea that the government is going to try to dictate to a college or a university what it can teach, who can teach it, how it should hire, whom it should admit, all of those things are just deeply threatening to the whole enterprise of learning, to the idea of academic freedom and freedom in general, and will need a great deal of opposition. And I don't mean to suggest that the public universities are entirely different, because they are also organized to have academic freedom, and these things are threats to academic freedom in a very, very deep way. And what the administration has done is deeply, deeply inimical to that. On the K through 12 side, I think it was Alicia who used the phrase academic freedom. I don't really think of academic freedom as a relevant category in the K through 12 space. I think the problem here is that the substance of what this administration wants people to teach, as the chancellor has said, includes teaching students things that are not true and avoiding teaching students things that are true. This is a know-nothing policy, and it's disturbing on that level. Nevertheless, my own civic preference remains that states be able to do it if that's what their polities want. But the idea that the federal government should be pushing them or threatening them in order to get them to do it is a affront to federalism, and is also a deep mistake.
Thank you so much for that. I want to make sure we leave time for audience questions. So I'm going to pose one more question to the group and then turn it to some of the great questions I'm already seeing coming in through the audience. So I guess this is one I'll also pose to each of you, because you've all been observing these developments from different perspectives as an administrator, an educator, a legal expert, a reporter who's been speaking directly to principals, teachers, parents. I'd love to hear kind of the school level. How are you seeing schools respond, fight back, not fight back against policy changes that they may think are harmful to their students? Erin, or Martha, would you like to kick us off, please?
Sorry, I was going to say, I think it's really hard for schools. I think they're in a really tough position because, no one wants to lose funding for any reason. Even with the recent pause in funding that the Office of Management and Budget is reviewing, districts that I've spoken to are kind of panicked about that. They don't really know, school's going to start here in Georgia in about 3 weeks, and they don't know if some of their after school programs are going to be fully funded yet. So I think they're in a really tough position. And as much as they may like to fight back, they rely on that funding for a lot of things and for a lot of kids. So I think they're in a tough position. I think, administrators are in a tough position. I think we're in a very much figuring out phase. People are trying to figure out how to go about things, the best way to do it. Do I approach, the state superintendent about this? How do I get my program funded? They're really still trying to figure out how to navigate it.
Would anyone else like to jump in? Chancellor King.
I think Martha's exactly right. It's also confusing, I think, for parents, because they may not see the change yet, but the change is coming. So they may not know what the funding losses will be for their school or district. They may not be aware of how the absence of the Office for Civil Rights will give them less recourse if their child with a disability isn't getting the services they're entitled to. So we do have a sort of parent information challenge here. On the higher ed level, I will point out, I think one of the reactions to this policy environment has been a fair amount of anticipatory over compliance, where people worried about the administration taking action against them are sort of voluntarily doing things that the law does not require of them. And that worries me, because it really means that the administration has a lot of leverage through threat, even if that is not a fact of the law or any congressional authority that they have.
Thank you. Erin, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I do, but given the pressure, I think I'm going to just say that the metaphor of the bully seems like the right one. Like the idea that you should resist a bully is great if you have a chance to do it effectively, but otherwise you end up bleeding on the sidewalk and without your lunch money. And I think that very responsible school officials in both the K-12 and the higher ed sectors are deeply concerned about the damage that can be done if there isn't some acquiescence. That's the reason that we're seeing this over-compliance. It's an effort to placate a fairly unpredictable source of threat, and those threats can and will and have done real damage. And so it is a very difficult position for people who run these institutions to be in, just and only in the sense of trying to serve their constituents, to know is the right thing to do to resist, is the right thing to do to comply, or even is the right thing to do to be somewhat obsequious and over-compliant in hopes of placating the next round of actions that could come. I don't envy any of these folks their jobs, including the chancellor.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for all of that. I'm going to turn now. We have some excellent questions from the audience. The first one I'll raise is about a topic we haven't covered yet, which is policies related to, or how will the administration's policies affect disabled students, including students who have IEPs, individualized education programs, or 504 plans, which are both programs designed to support students with disabilities. Would anyone like to take that one?
Yeah, I've spoken to some parents who are concerned about that. I know this is not going to be a very popular answer, but I think a lot of it is unknown right now. In some cases, I think states and local districts are willing to step up and are able to step up if that funding doesn't come through. But I think in other cases, it's kind of a question mark. And I know it's a big area of concern. People are concerned about it. And I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer, but I think it just kind of will be a case-to-case basis.
The antipathy of the administration to inclusion as an ideological matter so far does not really seem to extend to the inclusion of disabled children. So the IDEA request in the new budget is flat. They have zeroed out a bunch of particular programs for disabled children. So I think total funding has gone down somewhat. I think the biggest effect will be if resources disappear overall. Disabled children are always at the front lines of budget crunches, and it's concerning how that will play out.
And I just underscore, as I mentioned earlier, the OCR stakes here, that the Office for Civil Rights is the place to go if your child isn't getting the services they need and the state hasn't been responsive or the local district hasn't been responsive. And my worry is we've already seen the layoffs and shuttering even of regional OCR offices. Will parents have less recourse if they aren't getting what they need? But we'll have to see that play out, over the coming months.
So the next question I'll pose to the group relates to the recent resignation of the president of the University of Virginia, and would love to hear your reflections on that resignation and what it might tell us about the existing threats to academic freedom in the current environment.
It's heartbreaking. I mean, Jim Ryan is a wonderful human being. Let me start with that. Who has tried to lead his institution with integrity. I don't know the specifics of the investigations that the administration was doing, but it's very sad to lose such a talented leader in the sector. And I worry that the takeaway for the rest of the sector was that the administration is willing to go after presidents as individuals in order to accomplish their policy objectives, particularly around dismantling of diversity, equity, inclusion. Without question, part of what happened in Virginia is a state politics story, that the board at UVA is largely appointed by Governor Youngkin, and that meant the board was not necessarily prepared to stand up for academic freedom at University of Virginia.
I've known Jim Ryan a long time, although not well, but he's been an extraordinary educational leader. And this was just a case of apex bullying by the administration. coming after individuals like this is really deeply concerning. I keep using the word concerning. It's too mild. Like it's a very bad development. It's bad for higher ed, and it is true that it would have been harder to do this in a state with a different political environment. But the idea that the demands of the federal government include the firing of individuals is just not the way that an education system that's going to be excellent can run. It can't run this way. And so it's done enormous damage.
Yeah. Martha, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I would just add that it's, Thomas Jefferson's university, founded the university. I'll just leave it at that.
I'll move on to the next question. Again, talking about states and state politics to some extent, how will states ensure that districts, especially poorer ones, can meet the educational needs of their students in the current moment? Aaron, would you like to take that?
I don't know that they will. I have to say, I don't know that they will. First, it ought to be said, it's not clear that they were doing it before this administration. Right there, it's not obvious proposition that poor districts were meeting the educational needs of their students before the Trump administration came back to Washington at the beginning of the year. But the fundamental facts are that there is in many states, and not just red states, not full political commitment to this group of children as an absolutely high priority item. They often lose out to other groups. And as the budgets get tighter and still have to be balanced, I think it's very plausible that the group of students in poor districts with high educational needs are going to come out on the losing side. The way to meet their needs is to pay for them. And that's a very difficult proposition, both politically and fiscally.
And what are the numbers? Is it about 10% overall of state budgets at the K through 12 level come from the federal government, but more in some poorer districts? Is that about right? Can we orient our listeners a little bit to the dollars at stake?
Yes, prior to the new budget, the federal government was providing about 15% of K through 12 educational spending nationwide. And that number varies very substantially by district because Title I, which provides federal money to poor districts, that money goes straight from the federal government to the poorest districts. And so in districts that got Title I money, the share of federal resources was much higher.
Martha, how are these conversations playing out in Georgia and some of the communities that you're speaking with?
I think it varies by community. Some of the bigger districts that are in Metro Atlanta have some resources, I would say, to fill some of the gaps that maybe they wouldn't if it were to happen that Title I funds didn't make it to a certain program. But districts are tightening their belts right now. Costs are going up, like construction costs are going up. These are not the days of COVID when school systems were getting just unprecedented amounts of money coming in from the federal government. So districts right now are having to tighten their belts. And, they're having these conversations about what if. And I would say that for smaller districts, it will be tougher. I think the question is right. It's harder to figure out those kind of funding problems, especially if they rely on a lot of Title I money. But some of the bigger districts can maybe move things around. But it's tough. It's not easy, I think, for any school district to really figure it out right now, especially if they had already budgeted the money.
And it's just important to remember the practical implications, right? Which is if I'm in a high needs district that is reliant on Title I dollars or Title III dollars for English learners or some of the grant programs that are currently being withheld, if I don't have those dollars, I'm going to end up needing to lay off teachers, make class size bigger, reduce advanced placement classes, get rid of after school and summer programs, reduce enrichment opportunities for students. Those are the stakes for kids and families.
Turning to another question from our audience, what avenues are open to states to the extent that they think the federal government has overreached, has exceeded its powers? What exactly can states do?
I think Aaron should start because
Okay.
We're putting all the
There-
pressure on you.
there- I mean, I think at the very broadest level, they have two options. They can sue and they can negotiate. Those are the options that are available when one is in this kind of environment. Neither of those strategies looks particularly enticing at this moment. I think this administration has raised to a new level the view that not negotiating, or at least not negotiating in the standard way of making steady progress towards agreement, is a power move that it's certainly not standard operating procedure. And in some other policy areas, we're seeing it also, sometimes with surprising effect. So I don't really imagine that negotiation looks terribly attractive. Lawsuits are slow, they are expensive, and right now, it appears that that the Supreme Court of the United States is interested in allowing the administration to do what it likes until and unless a final disposition in a lawsuit is reached, and that's a matter of years. And so, I mean, I guess it's not true that the only strategies are negotiation and lawsuits. The third negotiation is to try to compensate, right? You can try to rework your own internal organization to make it more, to make it able to respond to the losses. But as the chancellor has said, that's going to be in an environment of extraordinary pressure, and there's no way to do that in a way that will prevent kids from being harmed by it.
Thank you for that. I'll pose that question to the rest of the group and maybe broaden it a bit to say also, what can citizens do? I think we have a lot of people watching today that want to know what can they do in this moment.
Look, members of Congress need to hear from their constituents about these issues. You know, we've been trying with our members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to point out the stakes for their constituents if Pell Grants are cut, the stakes for their constituents if there's less spending on research for the cures for Alzheimer's or cancer, or the treatments that will help improve people's lives. They have to understand the stakes. Similarly, from a K-12 perspective, folks need to understand the programs that are at risk, the opportunities that are at risk. And I still would like to believe, maybe because I was a high school social studies and civics teacher, that hearing from the citizens about their views will have an impact on members of Congress. And they are the decision makers here on appropriations. They're the decision makers on whether or not there's an education department. So we've got to make sure they understand what we believe.
Martha.
Yes, I would agree with that. Definitely use your voice. In this case, it's, as the chancellor said, it's Congress that's kind of controlling things. But I would also take the opportunity to say, find out who your local school board members are, definitely research them, make sure you vote in the next school board election. Those tend to be pretty low turnout, and they make big decisions about schools. So, if I could just throw that in as a point of interest as well.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful, rich discussion. I'm so appreciative of everyone's time and participation. I'm going to close it out with one final question that I'll ask each of you to answer, which is that in a few sentences, what is one thing you want our audience to walk away from this afternoon? And I will turn it to Martha first.
I will say support local news, please. We're trying to bring you these stories of people and how these decisions in Washington affect people. Please listen to, subscribe, consume local news.
Thank you. Aaron.
This is an earthquake. It's very, it's going to be a very difficult period for K-12 institutions. But I think one of the lessons here is that federalism is in many ways more important than ever. The states are the key institution here. They do have the capacity not just to acquiesce to the administration. They're a separate base of power. And that's where our eyes should be in trying to minimize and redesign systems to make schooling as good as we can for children.
Thank you. And Chancellor King.
I'd say that K-12 and higher education are the foundation for the long-term success, not only of our economy, but our democracy. We all have to stand up for education, insist that education is a national imperative. You know, in May, we have a Teacher Appreciation Week. And while it is lovely that teachers get lots of Starbucks gift cards during that week, what we really need people to do is to vote like they love teachers, show up at school board meetings like they love teachers, call their legislators at the state and federal level like they love teachers, show their commitment to education and public education in particular through action.
Thank you. Thank you again to this fantastic panel and to our audience for all of the wonderful questions. I wish we had time to answer everything. To everyone watching today, the Brennan Center looks forward to seeing you at future events. To be the first to know when events are announced, you please consider signing up for our events newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. Again, I'm Alicia Bannon, Editor-in-Chief of State Court Report. Thank you all so much for coming.